My name is Allison Lucan. I have long been a data-driven storyteller in media, and I recently joined the Seattle Kraken as a contributor at their website and their TV analyst for game broadcast. And I'm thrilled to be welcoming three other women in the sports analytics industry. We're going to talk about careers in sport analytics. And I've shared this with some of you. I just want to encourage each of you, please, I don't need this to be, I ask a question, you answer. We want to have as much of a dialogue. Interrupt me, ask each other questions. Let's see what we can learn from one another. Let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we'll let each of these fine people tell you their path to where they are today. First, we have Jessica Hensley. And Jessica is a data analyst with the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. She's been there for 2 years. And she has been in Tokyo recently. She graduated from Emory and Henry College with a degree in mathematics, and also has interned at ESPN. And in the meantime, also got a master's degree in Statistical Data Science from Florida State University. Welcome, Jessica. We also have Kelsey Roberts. Kelsey is a database and basketball analyst for the New York Knicks. She's also worked with the Pacers in Indiana, the Miami Heat, and she has a bachelor's in international business from Xavier University and a master's in statistics from the University of Arkansas. And last but certainly not least is Sarah Ziegler, the sports editor at 538. She's also the host of the Hot Takedown podcast, which is a fun, great listen. She's a native of South Dakota and an alumna of Iowa State University. Welcome, Kelsey, Sarah, and Jessica. Again, I'm here just to keep the conversation going. We'll go around the group to start because I'd really like our attendees to hear from each of you the path that you took to getting where you are today. We can talk about where someone graduates from. We can talk about a job title, but three of us have analyst in our title, and it probably means something different to everyone. So Jessica, maybe you can start and talk us through maybe when that first interest in analytics or data started for you and your path to where you are today.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in Florida, honestly, where there wasn't many career options that were known to you as a high school student. I went to college thinking I would be a math teacher and a swim coach because honestly, as a female who loved math, like that's what you did in my town. I got to college and my honors director actually was like, I think that you should really look at statistics and maybe try an internship and see where that takes you. I think that you would like something outside of teaching, not that that's not a great career, but I think that you would actually really enjoy doing some data analytics. So I first interned at a statistical consulting firm called Elder Research, and that I self-taught myself R there and really just loved everything. I loved that you could actually use math and statistics and apply it to the real world. So the big project I worked on there was in Baltimore, and the Baltimore riots were happening that summer, and Twitter actually knew about the riots before the police did. So our client wanted to create a anomaly detection system through Twitter using tweets to identify anytime sentiment kind of turned angry or bad and create an alert to send them to tweets. Twitter was also booming at that time, and so that was the project, and I just loved being able to apply what I could do to the real world. So from there on, one of the projects they actually gave me was NFL Super Bowl data, and I was caught there. Like that's all I wanted. From then on, I went to Sloan the next year, and my eyes were just open to the whole world of possibilities within sports analytics. So that's when I looked for internships. I applied to probably thousands of internships for the next summer. Got one as a business analyst with the Hornets and got to work on ticket pricing, scheduling, NBA schedule recommendations, lots of really cool things that had actual implications, which is what I just fell in love with. Then went to ESPN, was a stats and information group intern there. Loved that world too, but really thought I wanted to go more into the sport performance world, either basketball ops analytics, because timing of graduation for me was when NBA analytics was really taking off. But decided to go to Florida State just because my undergrad was only a math major. They did not have statistics at my undergrad. It was a very small school. They did not have computer science. like even like a class. So I was completely self-taught and decided I should get some more formal training. Went and did a statistical data science program to get a little bit more formal training in statistics and data science. And a opportunity came up on Teamwork that was a data analyst for the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And the idea of it, immediately I was caught. I was like, this is what I want to do. This is the perfect place for me. I was a swimmer all throughout college. I can do swimming, I can do track, I can do bobsled, I can do all these other cool sports that don't really have analytics yet. Super involved with them. So I didn't actually get the first job because they needed someone like 5 months before I graduated, but I kept in touch with them, and a job opening happened to come in December, and I graduated at the end of December and moved on across the across the country a couple weeks later.
Amazing, amazing. Well, speaking of a sport, NBA, where data is booming, Kelsey, share your story with us and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so I have to say, I think mine's a little different because when I was in high school, I took AP statistics and computer science, and I hated it. I was like, I never want to do anything with this. I'm not good at it. I like, as soon as I left high school, I was like, I'm not doing anything related to math. I'm staying away from it. I'm so bad at this. So in college, I studied international business, thinking I wanted to do like marketing or I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was 18. Like, does anyone at 18 really know what they want to do, right? So, got a degree in international business and worked in that field. So I worked for the company that makes like Jergens lotion, Curel lotion, Biore skincare, consumer packaged goods, essentially. And when I got that job, some of my friends were still in college. I graduated a year early and were in stats class, and I was tutoring them in it because I did well in AP stats. I just hated it, and in college. So when I started tutoring them in stats, I kind of like I liked it then. I was teaching people stats, and I thought still I was like, I'm never gonna do anything with this. Like, I'm just gonna help them not fail the class. And then one of my coworkers and I decided to take. There's a group called Girl Develop It, that kind of teaches different coding classes. So when I was in my first job out of college, I took a class with her during the week after work for fun, like building websites. And that's when I loved coding. In high school, I took C++, and I was like, I never want to touch this ever again. This is miserable. And then so I kind of found out like my passions for it when I wasn't in a school environment and I could do it for fun. And so then I moved to Arkansas to work on like the Walmart account for my company. And it was when I was there that I thought maybe I want to get a degree in stats. Like, I've been helping my friends with stats class, and I kind of missed, like, in a lot of times in work, someone would say something like, oh, then, this sales are significantly higher than this. And I would say, is it though? Like, statistically, I would have like this, like, anytime someone would say that, I'd like wince and no, it wasn't anything math related. So that kind of encouraged me to go back. And from there, I was just kind of looking online for internships in that field and came across, ironically, Hornets and Pacers. And I applied to both, one in business analytics and one in basketball analytics. Ended up getting both offers and then deciding to go to the Pacers because I had already done business analytics and was ready to see what the basketball ops world would be like. I'd always loved basketball. I never thought I would ever work in it because I didn't like math in high school. But after I got that internship, that's when I really fell in love with it. And from there, from there it led into the Miami Heat internship. And I will say too, I never went the networking route. I just applied online to everything. Applied online to the Pacers, got it. Miami Heat, applied online, didn't know anybody, got that. Same with the New York Knicks. So after I finished grad school, I think I found it on LinkedIn because someone had just left, and I applied like really not knowing anybody there or knowing anything about that team or who worked there, and interviewed, and so I'm going into my second season with the Knicks now.
That's amazing. The internet
Don't
is
like math
good for
now.
something.
Keep it open mind.
The internet is good for something. I love
Yes.
these different paths. Sarah, I'm so excited to hear you share your story because you're looking at sport and analytics through a different lens. So tell us your story.
Yeah, my path is to this job has been a very, very strange one and very different from Jessica and Kelsey. Although I started out in college as an engineering major and switched to journalism like I don't know, half a semester in, I was like, right away, I was like, oh no, I don't want to do this. But it's funny that I come back to that kind of mindset now in a statistical environment. So I was a journalist. I wanted to be a journalist. And I was an editor, really almost from the word jump. I had a couple of reporting internships and realized I thought it was very important, but not something I wanted to do. So I was a copy editor coming out of college and worked for a newspaper for many years. And really, I went to college at a time before the sports analytics craze, really back in the 90s. There wasn't this kind of focus on analytics. It was like Bill James and like that was it. So there really, I loved sports, but I didn't really know that there was that path. There wasn't that path quite yet. So I was a journalist forever. And I got into sports analytics because so I was like in my early 20s. I was in a strange city. I was in a fantasy baseball league with a lot of guys that I didn't know very well, who didn't think that I didn't take me very seriously as a fantasy baseball player, let's just say. And that fueled me, and I wanted to beat them all very badly. And that's when I found Baseball Prospectus. And I started reading Nate Silver back in like 2003 when he was just doing baseball blogging. And I find that hilarious now as my career has turned out. But that's how I started really getting into understanding baseball statistics and then another advanced stats. So I was an editor for many years in Omaha, Nebraska, as newspapers have done what they have done. My husband and I decided, you know what, we don't have to live in Nebraska anymore. Our jobs at the newspaper may not exist in another couple of years. Let's leave. So we decided to move to New York and see what happened. And I managed to, I applied after a few months in a different job, I applied for a job at 538 and got that. And I started at 538 as a general editor. We're a very small shop. I really loved sports and was, interested in reading about sports. So I got pushed into the sports realm. I became the assistant sports editor. And then 2 years ago now, the then sports editor left and I was promoted to the sports editor job. So it's a really different kind of a path into caring a lot now about sports analytics.
That's awesome. It's funny. I was going to ask this question, but Kelsey, your story really brought this home to me. I'd like to ask the group, and Kelsey, we'll have you go first. I think a lot of times when people start thinking about, oh, I love math, I love sports, I love this specific sport, and I want to work in it, right? And sometimes we do want to work in the sport, and sometimes we don't. So that's the first part of this question, because Kelsey, you came back into basketball. But then also, given that you were doing more marketing-focused data work at first, I'd love to hear from you, and Kelsey, again, you'll go first. Just thoughts on, there's statistical understanding and education and skill we need. And then there's domain expertise, right? The sport in which we are working. Share what you have learned and what your opinion is on when you're looking for a career in sport analytics. How do you balance that? Can you come strong in one, build up the other? Should you be building both? Just your thoughts, Kelsey, on that. And also, again, maybe going to a sport you love or don't love.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost is being in this job, like technically there, because if you don't have the coding ability, I think you'd honestly drown. Like when you first start, you're kind of like thrown into it, at least for the work that I am doing. I think in general, they want you to have the hard skill set to do the job. And I think before you get into the NBA, like for me, it was my first internship with the Pacers. Like you think you watch a lot of basketball and you think you know a lot about basketball, and then you go into a meeting and you're like, wow, I know nothing. Like it's like this reality slap of, people are saying things and you're like, what are they talking about? And I think that comes easier than coding. Then, if you can do the technical work and you can figure out the models and you have that background, I think it's easier to, at the Pacers, the first month, I already learned so much from my boss, who was just brilliant and could explain, like to the front office really well, like what we were working on. But I think being around them, it's easier to pick up like these little things about basketball that they watch, especially sitting next to them at the game. You kind of like see things that they see and have been picking up for so long. Whereas I feel like if you don't have the technical skills in almost every position I applied to, there was a technical assessment where they give you a coding project, they give you a stats project, some type of coding that you have to show that you know what you're doing. So I think if you're going to focus on anything, obviously you have to know a little about basketball because it would be embarrassing if they like ask you about something you had no idea what you're talking about. But I think more than anything, it's easier to pick up the sport than it is technical ability.
And Jessica, how about you? Because you're working across some sports, there was a sport you had an affinity for. What is your opinion again on that technical versus domain expertise? And also, how do you build up one or both depending on what your opinion is?
Yeah, no, I agree completely with Kelsey. I think you have to have the hard skills, know what you're doing statistically, coding wise, everything like that. Very solid. And then you have to have a baseline understanding of the sport you want to go into. And as you definitely like prepare for interviews and stuff, you can definitely do your research on that side of things pretty quickly, right? You can research the team, who they've been drafting, and like all the background on the team to make sure you don't, mess up saying something in an interview, or they ask you about a player and you didn't hear about them, or anything like that. You can research that beforehand a lot easier than you could, like Kelsey said, do an entire assessment and have no idea what you were doing. Wouldn't go as well. For me, I work across every sport. So we have 61 different national governing bodies. And I rely on people within the sport to help with that knowledge. There's no way I could know the intricacies of every sport there is. So what I do a lot of times is I do kind of a baseline analysis, very baseline, not too in depth or anything. Then I take that to a national governing body and work with them in conjunction with the experts in the sport and completely go in saying, I don't know your sport like you do. Help me understand it. Help me understand what you need, what you want to learn, how I can help you. And then I bring the statistical help to them, but I'm not ever trying to act like I understand their sport or I'm an expert in it. That's their job. And so similar, like if you're working with one sport, you probably have to gain a pretty good understanding of it. But in my world, I can pick up on, they can help me understand that piece. I need to know the statistics and the coding to help them achieve what they're hoping to achieve.
Sarah, I'm so excited to hear your thoughts on this because you and I have to come at this in a different way. You're looking across sports as well. And if you're reporting on a sport, I feel like, and correct me if I'm misspeaking here, but we often have that if you don't know the sport well enough, it's dismissed as the nerds don't know what they're saying. And we also have to balance, if we're not in a team, we can't have passion for a team, right? We might be able to have a passion for a sport. So what's your experience and your opinion on balancing domain knowledge and technical skill?
Yeah, I think the key, I mean, technical skill, obviously super, super important. But if you don't have that understanding of a sport, a pretty, more than just a rudimentary understanding of a sport, you don't know which questions to ask and which things to try to solve. And so that can be a little tricky. I think that it's true that is easier to learn than like if you don't know R, you're not going to be able to do. So like you need to start there, obviously. But when you're getting into a sport, especially if you don't have a support staff that is really entrenched in a sport, if you're kind of working on your own, or if you're a writer and you're trying to cover, you really are going to have to know that sport well to know which things to answer. Otherwise, you're going to answer the same questions other people have, or pick up on something that is not important at all to the sport, so that it is really hard. And as we're working across a lot of sports, it's you can tell when someone doesn't quite know what is sort of parachuting into a sport. We really struggled. We were very cognizant of that with our Olympics coverage, that we wanted to get people who are experts in each sport and not try to pretend that like I know everything about biathlon. Like, no, I do not. I knew nothing about it, So really focusing on people who are experts there, and we can help then with the statistical, the statistical work. But someone who really truly understands the sport is just going to be such an expert on that from a writing and reporting standpoint.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I hope people are hearing what we're all saying too. Is that depending on the area where you're going to apply analytic and sport, there's different levels, right? Where you need that domain expertise, but also that technical skill. Some of you mentioned some of this, and so I want to drill down further on. We know what we're talking about. We know what we're analyzing. And Sarah, I'm going to go right back to you. the importance of effective communication of the work you're doing. And whether you're in an organization or formally a communicator as a journalist, what lessons have you learned? What advice do you have, again, for our attendees today? The importance of communication and techniques or important points to think about when you're trying to communicate statistical work in the sport field or statistical information in general. Sarah.
Yeah, this is the thing that when I talk to people who want to work for a team, don't want to be a journalist, want to be in sports analytics, which I assume is most people here today. The thing that I say every time is take a communications class in college, because like nothing you could find, you could solve NFL defense, which if you do, please give me a call. I'd be very interested in that. But if you can't explain it, then it's not going to do you any good. It's so important to be able to talk to your front office about why you're asking them to do a coach to take a different approach. That's one of the hardest things, right, in our world, is trying to get people who are old school and know it when they see it or whatever. We're like, no. Math. But being able to communicate that, I think, is so important. So write for the school paper, take a communications class, learn how to communicate your ideas. That will help you, in many areas of your life. But it will really, I think, make your statistical findings more effective and really be able to get your point across when you can communicate that. I think that's super important.
Kelsey, the minute you shared the story of where someone would share something and you said, "Are you sure about that?" You were even challenging the communication that you were receiving, right? So what have you learned about taking data, taking statistical analyses, and just communication in general? And then maybe there's something specific to sport as well.
Yeah, for me, because I'm working with scouts a lot and, people who are in charge of scouts, like they don't really care about the math. They just want to know the answer. So I think for me, it's really just like dumbing it down. And when I build or model, if I know like the college, like draft model, for example, like the college scouting group, like it's better to build one that might be slightly less accurate, like from a statistical standpoint, that you can explain better, because they say like, why is this guy projected higher than this guy? You can say, oh, because of these three variables, like it weights them this way. And they're pretty like in tune with that at this point. They've been working in it for so long that they know that the math nerds coming in will have like some variable that they want to share. But I think for me, because I'm working, especially on the pro scouting side, a lot of these guys were basketball players at some point, and they know a lot about like the sport and how they're watching people and what skills they think they have. So I always try to say like, oh, from an analytics perspective, we see this guy is really good at this. And sometimes they disagree, sometimes they agree. But I think for me, like I try to stay away from the, like math terminology, because you just lose them, and then they just glaze over, and it's like you lose that camaraderie and like the talks that you can have. So for me, it's like if they ask, being able to like easily explain something, but I try to keep it pretty high level with the stats talk usually.
Jessica, I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say, because you already told us that you have to go to people and say, I don't know this sport that well. So what are lessons you've learned when maybe you are crossing more topics? How do we effectively communicate the work that our data can help support or inform?
I feel like I heard this a lot in school, but I see it every day, is knowing your audience. Specifically for me, I could go to say USA Swimming. They actually have like 3 analysts in their in-house. I can speak analytics to them. I can go to them with cool models. I can go to them with tons of data, and they know what I'm saying. They're interested, they follow. Whereas if I'm going to say a USA team handball, who is like 3 staff total, right? They don't have a data person. They are just trying to make everything happen. I'm not going to go to them with a whole model on how they should run things or who they should recruit, who they should talent transfer. That's not how I'm going to approach them. We're going to go to them with more very simple data visualizations that they can just see the data in a picture, nice little way that they can understand it. And then they can look at it and be like, oh yeah, that dip is because blah, blah, blah. And then they give me, as they're interpreting it, they give me that knowledge that I was lacking, that I didn't know what caused that dip because I didn't follow their sport super closely. So it's really about knowing your audience and knowing what you can bring them and what they can digest. Some NGBs, I go to national governing bodies, so like a USA Track and Field, etc. Sorry. I can go to them and give them analytics. Some I know that they just really want a tool they can use. So it's more about building like an R Shiny app where they can accomplish something. And so it's knowing who your audience is, what they need, and what they're going to actually react to and catch on to. Some might not even be at that step yet, where you're just going to start bringing them little bits of things as you go so that they can start to trust in it. Some are fully trusting you can bring a model to. So it's really just knowing your audience and knowing how to approach them and then what to bring them.
That's huge. I was going to ask this and you already read my mind, is that, I always think about too, like visualizations as a huge key tool. And then also, as you said, I know a lot of people who work with scouts go to an app or an interface where it's about presenting data in a more clean way. I'll open this to the group really quick. Are there any other tools or different methods of communication that you guys are using? I don't know what it might be, if it's an interactive, if it's something else that we haven't already talked about. Maybe there isn't. I just thought I'd ask. We're thinking.
Whenever I send something that has a lot of like stats abbreviations too, I typically send like a glossary with like an explanation, an example, so that if they have a question, like I'm obviously happy to answer it, but it's also like providing that those key takeaways and something that they might like. It's obviously I'm used to it because I use it all the time, but knowing that they're looking at like, PER and like, what's that? Like having like all of that kind of written out for them so that they can reference it. And it's almost like training them to learn the stats at the same time, but in a non-aggressive way.
We're hiding vegetables in their pasta is what we're doing.
Right.
So the next thing I was curious about, and again, I think about people wanting to get into this field. Kelsey, I'm going to go right back to you because of your story and how you came to your current position. I think when we follow sport from the outside and we see sports data that is available publicly or how data is applied to sport publicly, sometimes the perception is actually very different when you're on the inside. And I'm certainly not asking you to give away any team secrets, but what can you share about the realities of understanding what the public thinks sports analytics are, even the data we think is real or not real from a sport perspective, and maybe how that might feel, look, or be applied differently if you're working for an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think the perception of our jobs in general, like when I say I'm a basketball analyst, people think one, like I'm a TV person that's like, and this player had, like, that's not what I do. But they also ask me like, oh, are you sitting on the, court tracking like how many points this player had, and like, that's totally not what it is either. But I think people look at box scores and they think that I'm like doing the box scores for some reason. But I think internally, like we just have more access to different data that's not publicly available, like player tracking data is a big one that like I think at this point all 30 NBA teams have it, but I think it's just a lot more granular than people think usually. So I would say that, I mean, a lot of it, like if you go onto NBA stats, like there's a lot of stuff that I reference on there too, just high level. And but I think the player tracking data is really where probably the bigger difference comes in, because we can really get granular with plays and pick and rolls and like really specific actions that they track really well with player tracking data. So I think it's like we just have access to more data, I think, that isn't necessarily publicly available, that we use a lot inside the organization.
Sarah, how do you see the difference between what the public thinks sports analytics may or may not be and what you've seen inside a variety of sports over the years?
Yeah, it's funny. We sort of think our readers are pretty well-informed sports fans and know a lot about the data, but the data that that we try to be really transparent about what we show. But there are some things that are just not publicly available, and there are some things we do get access to, which is great, but we'd love to be able to show the whole list of stuff, but like that's not how it works. That's not what the agreement says. So I feel like from our perspective, people tend to know we don't have to do a lot of explaining of, we don't have to explain on base percentage or stuff like that. Now we may have to explain like weighted on base percentage or some of the, slightly more advanced things, but that's an interesting conversation too, always to like figure out how much information is like, we don't want to be condescending. We don't want to like over explain something, but then we also want to be welcoming to people who don't understand the sport and get people to understand sports analytics better. So that's always a weird kind of line to walk to, where who is our audience and what do they know, and what what can we tell them, what can we assume that they know already. It is, I will say one thing there, I have heard from an NBA team that looks at our an NBA agent whose player looks at our Raptor dashboard and has used that to try to negotiate a contract. And I'm like, that is amazing. I love that. That feels like a big win, So it is funny that there are teams using it and looking at it, or like looking at it and like maybe side-eyeing it, but like it to know that it's part of the conversation is pretty cool, I think.
Jessica, what's your perspective on, and particularly with you, I mean, some sports people may not even realize analytics are being applied.
Yeah, I feel like in my world, it was the realization that we don't have the data for a ton of things. So coming from like working in the NBA, ESPN, like you had all the data, it was already clean most of the time. Like that was not what you were doing. In my world, there's so much web scraping, data scraping. We're trying to find bobsled skeleton results from China and Japan and trying to pull those to compare with ours. And like, it's so much of the data scraping and cleaning world. You would think coming to the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee that you would have this great database and all of this data. It's not the case at all, just because the sports aren't like NBA teams, right? You don't have these 30 teams and you have these X amount of players that you're tracking the whole time. We are still trying to even define who we're tracking, right? So trying to figure out what juniors we should be tracking, because we don't really track them until they get onto that international scene. And then we only have data on the American athletes. And so trying to compare that to around the world athletes, we just don't have any data on them. We pretty much just have results data for most of the rest of the world. Sometimes we don't even have that great for some sports, right? For swimming, for a track and field, you can get results data pretty well, but for some of the lesser known sports, and from the Paralympic side, getting the data and gathering the data is a huge task and not an easy one. So I think people think it's just, doing all the analysis and making these cool dashboards and visualizations. But from my world, it's a lot of trying to find accurate, reliable data, scraping it, cleaning it, figuring out how we can compare it with all of the other data and combine it across the player tracking data, across our financial data, all the different aspects, to try and pull it all into one place is a huge portion of my daily life.
And let's pull back the curtain on that a little bit, because many analysts I speak to, particularly as data does get more and more advanced in sport, tracking data is like the holy grail for us in the NHL. We're hopeful we get that fully soon someday. But the realities are, at least some people I've talked to, this is not building happy models and doing amazing things and coming up with revelations every day. There's some real grunt work involved. And Jessica, you just outlined some of it. Kelsey, share the ugly truth, the realities of being in this world that you're in.
Yeah, it's definitely not all like intense modeling and finding these like new ways to do things. A lot of it's like you get a call from somebody and it's like something pretty unintelligent sometimes. Like it just takes a while. Like some of the asks you get aren't like, oh, let me think statistically how I would do this. A lot of it's like, I really want a page that has these players ranked this way. And you're like, all right. And then it's just kind of like a pretty like easy task sometimes. I think there are longer term projects that obviously require a lot more stats stuff, like any of the modeling, draft modeling. Like there's so much that goes into in general, like a lot of the models for, projecting players and but a lot of the time too, like during the year, there's just a lot of like random questions that come up that aren't necessarily like super involved. It's just, oh, here's what you asked for. And sometimes it takes like an hour to put together, sometimes more, sometimes less. But yeah, a lot of it. And I think no matter how much data you have too, like there are still days where I'm web scraping things because, well, one, that's like my favorite thing to do. It's like my hobby. Just in general, I'm obsessed with web scraping. Like I just find stuff online. I'm like, maybe I'll pull this into a database for myself. Like I'm obsessed. Like that was one of my hobbies in grad school too. Like I would just find things and web scrape them. So I never get away from that because I think there's always things that they don't have an API or like whether it's legal or not. It. So they might blacklist me. I'm not sure. But I think there's a lot of that too, like a specific way that you want it, and you're like, oh, this site has it. Let me just scrape the columns and plop it in there. So yeah, it's not always like the most intelligent math thing I've ever done. Sometimes it's just getting it done, you know.
And Sarah, I don't know if you've seen this, but you know, I've seen some organizations, sometimes just the data management itself is so big that if that is your passion, there might be a role just to do that. Maybe you aren't doing the hardcore analysis, and that's amazing. It's so valuable. Are there other interesting roles that maybe you've seen because you've looked across all these sports where the perception of what this work can be is maybe different than what maybe some of our attendees think?
Absolutely. We're actually 538 is currently hiring for a data editor, someone who's just really going to manage particularly our polls database, because obviously we do politics too. I don't know if you guys know that. But yeah, and another job that we have at 538 that I think is super cool is a quantitative editor, and it's someone who just like edits people's data. So okay, you've run some code in R, and our quant editor is going to go through it line by line and check it. And I love that. Yeah, I think it's like super. I think it's really helpful. Some people are a little annoyed that they, you know, that their work is being checked or whatever, but most people are like, oh my God, that's amazing to have that kind of support to make sure that you're, you know, what you're trying to say is correct and it was gathered the right way and was analyzed the right way, which I think is awesome. And I think more newspapers should have it, but I think just more places should have that kind of support staff for that kind of. So that's a very cool kind of thing too that's out there as well.
Yeah, to that end, Jessica, with, you know, we talk about cleaning, scraping, building an app, doing whatever it is. Maybe it's a search, maybe it's a query, maybe it's rerunning a report. Are there roles or skills that maybe you wish you had or had when you came in? Or is there, if budget was no question, right? Of course. Are there other staff roles that you think could be really valuable when people are thinking about this is a career in sport analytics that I might pursue?
Yeah, I wish I had more understanding of like the back end. So kind of more of the IT world and the back end of the databases, just so that that's another really cool and interesting job to me is we have our IT database architects, and they're the ones that we're working constantly with to be like, hey, I built a new web scraper. I need it to run every Monday at 4 a.m. and input into this database so I can access it for these reports, etc. But I wish I definitely had a better understanding of what they do and how they do it so that I could talk to them about it more intelligently. Sometimes I'm like, they're speaking a whole different world than me right now, and I don't know what they're quite saying, but we're just going to keep going and hopefully we get to the right place. So I do wish that I knew SQL and had kind of a base understanding, but just the actual like architect and how one's built in the whole, like we have a stage environment, your dev environment, your stage environment, your production environment, just kind of understanding that whole world at a baseline. When I came in, I feel like I've gathered it as I went along, but there was a lot of stumbles along the way. So I wish that I had a better understanding of that. And I think that's also a job that's needed, at least in our world, a lot more of. Our IT dev guys are constantly backloaded because it's not just my team coming to them with 800 different requests daily, but every team in the org is. And that's just, we need more of them, and because it needs to be done right? If you don't set up your database right, if they don't all talk to each other, in our world, we have hundreds of different databases and a whole system to make them talk to each other. But if one thing isn't done right and somebody goes rogue and doesn't set it up, then all of a sudden everything breaks and that database is completely siloed. And then they want reports that connect it. And you're like, well, you didn't quite set up the database right. It doesn't talk to everything else. So, and when you have not just like 40 or even hundreds of athletes. You have billions of athletes in the database trying to connect. You can't connect on name because, I mean, for the Tokyo, we had 2 people in the delegation of like 1,500 people with the exact same name. You can't do it on name and email address because half the time it's mistyped by the person putting it in, and just different things like that. So trying to connect if it's not done properly is a tough time. So that's one skill set I wish, and one job that I think is going to be like more and more people hiring for in the future, because we want more and more data, but we need the people to help on the back end.
Facebook might agree. Just throwing that out there. Just kidding. Kelsey, how about you? Skills or roles that you think are needed, you wish you had, or that you'd like to see evolve in the sport analytics space?
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky in the sense that I came in with data engineering experience, but I think to her point, like it is a pretty big thing. And when I was hired initially, my job was like a 50-50 split of data engineering and statistics. So I think that is really going to be really important. And I also would say software engineering for anybody on this call who is interested in that. That is becoming huge right now. Like I know like almost every team is right now hiring some type of developer, like full stack or some type of software engineer, because I think the push to have everything on like sustainable websites is becoming a big thing. And I'm not like, I know our Shiny like for, simple apps, but I'm not a like developer by any means. And I think that that's something that is going to be such a big push going forward. So I'd say like, if you're interested in any of that, like everybody's hiring a developer. Like almost every team recently has been hiring in the NBA and the MLB in general is always hiring developers. But I think that's going to be such an important skill set. It's like the front end website development, using the stuff that the analytics people are building, like models and reports, and being able to put those online as kind of like a self-service portal. I think that's going to be huge moving forward. I wish I knew more front end stuff so I could kind of like help people. I only know what I know at this point. And it's too much to know data engineering stats and all the front end. Like you got to draw the line in the sand somewhere. But I would say like that is such a huge opportunity. And now that hindsight's 2020, I'm like, maybe I should have done more web development stuff, because they're also making the money. So keep it in mind, everybody on this call.
And Sarah, that leads right to the question I wanted to ask you as well. I think when people think about working in sport analytics, the exciting stuff, the pop, is the new discovery or the new model. And that certainly is invigorating and tremendous work and important work. But are there trends that maybe you are seeing, whether it be in one sport and that's inspiring other sports, or trends across sport? In terms of analytics, are there, we just heard about, developers are becoming a thing. Web-based presentation is becoming a thing. Is there a different way people are looking at data? Are there different types of questions? Is tracking data unlocking some doors? What kind of things are you seeing outside of the go research this question and find the answer that may or may not be happening in sport analytics right now?
Yeah, there's some really exciting things happening in a lot of sports where we haven't always had great data. Soccer is this, like, there's so much we don't know about soccer, because the things that are measured are so specific, and so off ball stuff, player tracking is just like, it's the coolest thing. It's going to be amazing what happens, what keeps happening in all these sports. But there's some really exciting there's space for people to work in these, because we haven't traditionally had the data. Baseball is a sport where it feels like there's not a lot new to learn, because people have been digging so deeply for so long. Like, I made a joke about NFL defense before, but like, we don't know anything about NFL defense. Like, we know so little, and that is frustrating as someone who wants to like dig into it. It's also really exciting to see what people are going to see as we get, as the next gen stat stuff becomes more available and that kind of thing. So I think those sports where we haven't done as much are really exciting. I'm really excited for Olympic sport, to dig more into Olympic sports, because again, it's untapped. Like, you're not going to find people who are going to find new things about baseball. You are going to find people who are going to find new ways to look at and to optimize performance and medal counts, which is what we care about in the Olympics, right? For all these other sports. I think that is exciting. I mean, we saw that a little bit with gymnastics this summer. Like, there maybe wasn't the kind of team optimization that there was criticism of the team optimization. And I think thinking about that more analytically is going to help build a better team, particularly when we don't like have Simone Biles to build a team around. We're going to have to be smarter. And so I'm really excited about the gymnastics stuff too, I think, or the Olympics in general. I think that's going to be this great like world of new discoveries, that just because we haven't dove into that so far,
Well, Jessica, that tees you up, my friend. Any trends or new innovation that you see coming across sports from an analytic perspective?
I mean, exactly what Sarah was just saying. Like, so much is untapped in our entire world. You've got the handful of sports that have started to use and have databases and have started to use analytics, and the majority of them don't even have a database yet, right? So trying to work with them to set up the basics, set up databases. Like, I feel like more and more people are understanding that they need data, that they can utilize it. It could really help them, but they're like, where do I start? I don't even know what I'm doing. So starting with those teams and everything of, this is how you're going to set up a database. Like, what are you wanting to track? What do you think is important in your sport? How can we start tracking that? How can we get it into this database? Then we can help you analyze it and things like that. But just even, I'm going to be honest, for most Olympic sports, we're still at stage one. Like, we are still getting them to ask the right questions, figure out what data they need and want and think would be important, and then getting them to collect it. That's the level we're at with the majority of the sports. But I think that's an exciting time because there's just so much to do and so much unknown and so many findings that can be had. And even in the sports, like I said, I was a swimmer. That's a sport that has pretty good data, pretty good analytics. They have a staff. You talk about Tokyo and optimizing gymnastics. That mixed medley relay really needed some data behind it. That was a missed medal that very much, I was at the pool for that event, and there were whisperings of what the relay was on deck. And I was like, wait, that's the relay? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, okay, that's not winnable. Like, we lose by 5 seconds easy. Like, that specific setup, when you look at the data, it's not winnable. Females versus males in breaststroke and fly is just a bigger difference. And when I saw we went male, female, female, male, I was just like, nope, we're done. Like, it's not Caleb is Caleb Dressel, but he cannot overcome a 9-10 second gap. Like, that's just not humanly possible. So even in the sports where they do have some analytics going, there's still so much more that can be done to help them. So I don't know. I'm just so excited about all the possibilities and just getting it started for them for a ton of sports, especially as teams start to buy in. We've started to really gain the trust of most NGBs and sports. And I think that was really step one. And now we're on step two of how can we help? Let's start this whole process.
Awesome. We have just a few minutes left. So I have one quick fire question for everyone that came from one of our attendees, and then we'll wrap with one question to everyone. Kelsey, we'll start with you to answer this question. What coding languages and other data programs do you typically use in a standard day?
Yes, for me, the big three are R, Python, and SQL. I'm in those almost every day. And I would say, depending on the team you join, and depending on what their team was built in, like some teams are really Python focused and some teams are really R focused. But I think it's always helpful to know both. In that case, like I think Python's way better. The part of my job that is data engineering, Python's the way to go. And I also enjoy web scraping in Python more than R. I hit enjoy. But I think those three things are, for the data science world, the three I use the most.
Jessica, how about you?
Yep, completely second what Kelsey said. Depending on your organization, R versus Python or both. I use R. USOPC is very R focused, but there are definitely instances where I'm like, we should definitely be doing this in Python. Web scraping, things like that, where Python just does better at it. But we've set everything up to really only handle R codes as far as the backend stuff. So we make do with Selenium and R and things like that. And then the other big one for us is Tableau. So data visualization in Tableau, or Power BI for some organizations, but we're Tableau only.
Sarah, what are you seeing on a day-to-day basis as the must-know technologies and must-use?
We do most of our work is in R. Honestly, what for me personally, I'm checking things more in in Excel or Google Sheets. But we do mostly in R. There's a little Python. Nate works in Stata. Don't tell anyone. So
No one heard. No one heard.
yeah, that's like the oldest of old schools. But yeah, I mean R is definitely what we're mostly using.
Well, that's because ours the best. Okay, not that I'm biased. Anyway, well, we'll wrap with this. You all have just been so informative and so inspiring to think about the work that's being done. We would be remiss, it's cliche, but it's true. For our attendees, if someone is listening or watching and wants to find a way to break into analytical work in sport, what advice would you have for them? And Sarah, I'll go right back to you. What would you share with an aspiring data analyst of some kind of any role in sport today?
Well, I'll repeat my advice to learn some communications. Don't slough that off. Really do that. A great way to get yourself, one thing that people will say is, well, publish something, publish some, some findings, some work that you've done. A great way to do that is to write about it and write about it for your school newspaper. Then you have something to point to, a URL to send people. That will help you no matter what. But yeah, I would say just, apply to things apply to many internships, go out there and put yourself out there. And there are lots of opportunities right now. So it's a good time to get out there and really find something that you're passionate about.
Kelsey, I'm excited to hear your advice, particularly because you highlighted that you didn't go the networking route. You just straight out started applying. What would you say to someone who came to you and said, I want to break into this field?
Yeah, I would say if the job is coding heavy, putting stuff on your GitHub that you can link to your resume when you apply, so people can see your technical skills. And then I would just go on Teamwork Online and just go ham. Like apply to everything that you think would be good, because you never know who someone's going to resonate with your resume. And then I have sort of a weird interviewing tip too that people might advise on as well, but I think there's like this pressure to be like really buttoned up and say all the right things and be like really formal. But I would say like in my experience, a lot of the times where I've gotten an internship or a job is when they feel like they can really connect you as a person. So I'm bad because I like to crack jokes all the time and that's just like who I am. But I think if they know that that's really who you are and that's what they're getting and they like you as a person, it helps a lot too. Like obviously you have to have the technical skills and be able to do the job. But I think when you really connect with people on like a personal level to some degree when you're interviewing, it does help, at least in my experience. Like they know what they're getting from your personality and if they would like to work with you, I think is a big thing too.
I love that. Jessica, your advice to the burgeoning sport analytical professional.
Find your passion and don't give up on it. So like the others have said, like keep applying. I mean, Teamwork Online and going ham was exactly kind of my thought. I every single morning would wake up and just apply to every single new one that came up. And that's what I did for months, right, in college, because all it takes is that first one. You get the first one, and I promise your foot is in the door. Like, I know that's cliche, but it really does help because then you know people in that world. Similar to Kelsey, I did not do great at networking. That was not ever my forte. It was, I'm going to do good work and I'm going to let that speak for me. And so as soon as I got the first one with the Hornets, then Zepp and his whole team knew other people in the organizations around NBA and even other sports that could really help me when I needed it. But just don't give up and don't get not disappointed. I forget what the word I'm trying to go for is, but don't get upset if you're not even getting emails back. I'd say I applied to thousands, probably got 10 to 15 interviews out of those thousands, right? And most of them you will never even hear from. So don't get to, just keep working at it. Don't give up. Sorry.
No, that's great. Before we wrap, is there anything that I haven't asked that is front of mind or so important that you would like to share with our audience? Any of you feel free to speak up if you have any final points. You don't have to.
This is obviously an exciting, this is an exciting time, and if you're passionate about sports, there's a place for you in the world of sports. You can get there. It might be, the process might seem hard or just discouraging or whatever, but you can get there. You can.
I think there's a conception of like, I only want to work in basketball or I only want to work in football. But if you can get your foot in the door to a different sport to start off, like with an internship is how I started. And I was lucky enough to do NBA. But I would say like be open, and like I've known people who started in baseball and then moved to basketball and vice versa. Like I think if you have like some sports focused job or internship, even if it's a different sport, it'll still help you. So I would say be open with that as well.
And don't be afraid to like do smaller ones. So don't be afraid to go do a small G League team or anything like that. Or even I worked at my college in sports, and you know what? I started off as literally being the person that did the box scores at the table while basketball games went on, because that was the way I could get my foot in the door. And so don't be afraid. Take any opportunity you can get to get that experience, even if it might not be the exact type position that you're hoping to go into. It all matters.
Well, Jessica, Kelsey, Sarah, I know I speak on behalf of everyone who's been able to take in your incredible knowledge and wisdom today. We appreciate your time so much. We are so impressed by you. And I personally am inspired to see the work that each of you are doing in these different fields and forging your own path. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being part of our panel. And I'm sure we'll be seeing more great work from each of you soon. Thank you so much.